Right, and all.
This Boston 9/11 Truth, Zoom with Maxwell Bridges. I first, quote unquote, met Maxwell on the War Room with Jean La Rotunda. And he had a brief presentation there, very brief, but I thought it would be good to have him join us and talk about his blogspot. And so Maxwell has 2 decades long legacy that with Maxwell Bridges blogspot.com that documents his sincere research for 9/11 truth and evolution in understanding. He has a BA in foreign language, a BS in engineering discipline, MS in multidisciplinary tech field, and also 4 semesters of college physics for engineers and a semester group study on nuclear weapons. As part of the 9/11 movement, he's been libeled and slandered as an industrial strength 9/11 conspiracy theorist, quote unquote. In reality, he's just another blues brother on a mission from God. His directives concerning 9/11 are very clear. Feed my sheep, and quote unquote. 4th generation nuclear weapons, FGNW, were used in the destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And he's going to go through the evidence for nuclear components that leaks out of the entire 9/11 record. The overkill energy of the observed sudden complete decimation of the towers is a clue purposely missed. This article in his blogspot.com defends the premise that 4th generation nuclear weapons were deployed as the primary mechanism of destruction in the annihilation of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. So I have to admit someone else. There we go. And just to let you know that Maxwell wrote, I abridged it, but Maxwell wrote that introduction. So take it away, Max. Do you go by Max or just at all, or is it Maxwell?
I prefer Maxwell, but it's an online Batman, so.
Okay, take it away, Batman.
Right, so let me first start sharing. Okay, so. All right, so we're going to go on an Easter egg hunt for 9/11 Truth. Easter eggs. That's going to be an important concept here. So are you guys seeing my control panel for Zoom?
We're seeing the 9/11 Truth Easter egg hunt.
Okay, but you're not seeing my control panel. Okay.
No.
Good. All right. So the goal is to get to 9/11, 4th generation nuclear weapon or exotic nuclear weapons. I've learned over time to embrace the insults. If somebody calls me, batshit crazy, oh, sure, I'll accept that, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong. And in this case, I've gone through a lot of changes and a lot of evolution in my thought as to what was going on just by looking at the evidence. Anyway, let's go on with my presentation. I guess I need to. All right, so first of all, we need to ask ourselves, what are Easter eggs? And you guys already know they have them in films, they have them in comic books, they have every Easter egg is just some sort of little message or an image or a feature hidden in the software or a video game, film, whatever media you want to list. It's something there that is, for the dedicated fans and for the true fans, it's something for them to discover and get all happy about. In the 9/11 truth realm, though, Easter egg would be like a nugget of truth. Like typically it's an anomalous piece of evidence that is rarely, if ever, acknowledged and never adequately explained. And the fact that it exists in the public sphere, despite concerted efforts to ignore, the public sphere, despite concerted efforts to ignore, also makes it a nugget of truth. Also, it also makes it an Easter egg. Other Easter eggs are like offhand spoken or written comments by champions of various 9/11 premises. Points to the door of a research topic, but it doesn't actually open the door or step into it. Black holes. I don't know if this is something that I have coined, but it's something that I've discovered. But real black holes, in physics, are something that you can't see because no light is emitted, but you can tell because of the gravitational pull it has on neighboring objects or how they behave erratically, that something is there, that it exists. And in terms of like 9/11 Easter eggs, black holes are obvious and logical directions not taken. Like in the research or in the analysis, they are purposely avoided, and they're downplayed and mocked. In fact, that's why I started calling my premise fourth generation exotic nuclear weapons, because people were trying to mock it by calling it exotic nuclear weapons without actually describing what are exotic nuclear weapons. At any rate, we'll start off with a couple of saintly Easter eggs. David Ray Griffin is the patron saint of 9/11 Truth movement. What made him so powerful was that he stepped into the disinformation chapter by chapter, section by section, paragraph by paragraph, if he had to, and he told us what was wrong with this. He did that with Popular Mechanics. He did it in all of his books. I have a lot of respect for him. But one of his Easter eggs was none of the relevant evidence should be ignored. That is, that is a fundamental concept, and we're going to come back to that many times. Dr. Judy Wood is the matron saint of 9/11 Dude, and she wrote in the preface of her books something that was so important that she put it on a sticker and put it on the inside of her book so you wouldn't miss it. She's talking about the evidence, and all you guys can read. And by the way, most of my slides, I'm going to skip over some of the information in it because it's in other forms and you all can read. But what she is saying there is to look at the evidence. In her book, on her website, look at the evidence. Don't necessarily listen to what she's saying, but look at the evidence. That is what is important. So that's her major Easter egg. And that is something that gets egg on the face of other people who try to debunk, Do, or try to debunk Woodsy and Do or Dr. Wood, because they don't understand what her war really was. Now, with an egg on the face of me, why should you trust me? Actually, you shouldn't. In fact, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, distrust but verify. I don't have a physics degree. I don't have a degree in nuclear physics or security clearance or any form of access to any classified materials. But what I am is persistent, and I know how to research things, and I know how to read technical papers to know what might be true and what's not. My claim to fame to the 9/11 Truth movement is that I spelunk down into the 9/11 rabbit holes looking for Easter eggs and nuggets of truth. I've got superpowers of being naive and trusting until given reason not to be, which means, I have no reason not to go in the rabbit holes to see what is there, what is valid. Other things that I've done, claim to fame, is that I have gifted various people, who I was debating or in the 9/11 Truth movement with their version of Dr. Wood's, book, Where Do the Towers Go? Just so that I could get my discussion opponent on the same literal page so that we could look at the evidence. I'll let you guys read most of this. It's just me bragging about myself. It's all on my website in my last article about the author. At any rate, we need to go back into history. I need to move my this bar out of the way. How do we get this sucker? My the control panel for Zoom is kind of there. We go. So we need to look back into history. What does history teaches us? And William Casey gave out a great quote in 1981. We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the public believes is false. And we need to take that at face value. That is what they were working towards, and that was in 1981. So based on that, when the turn of the century came, and if you got astute people that are paying attention, you knew that in the aftermath of 9/11, that the powers that be would control the narrative. The government entities and corporate media, they would control the narrative. We also could have guessed right from the get-go that any organized group to congeal out of the loose and massive 9/11 truth movement would be infiltrated and controlled, would have their thumb on the wheel to steer public considerations away from things that they didn't want them thinking about, that they would slow walk and stall and delay. And in some cases, what I've discovered is that they would give important concepts the black hole treatment. So by extension, then, without even knowing what the 9/11 theory is, because of the efforts, any output from any of these infiltrated 9/11 truth groups is, mis or disinformation from the get-go. President Clinton, when he was still in office, made the quote, follow the trend lines and not the headlines. We know what the headlines for 9/11 were. It was a lot of patriotic propaganda to march the U.S. into wars and to get us to support these wars. And there wasn't a lot of research, wasn't a lot of effort putting into, was this even justified? And, can we really prove that these hijackers did it? But the trend lines behind the scenes was that all 9/11 information became disinformation. You just can't trust it. So therefore, because of what they were producing was stilted and not completely correct, when you're downstream from those reports that come out, you had no choice but to rely on them to some degree. But sometimes it's the people that produce those reports who did not like being put in that position of lying or having their reputation put on the line, that they inserted Easter eggs for us to find, to prove to us later on that, hey, they weren't completely aligned with this, but that they, were just following orders. And so they left something for us to discover. And so how do you survive in a world that's full of mis and disinformation? Well, you have to recognize that all disinformation is built on nuggets of truth. And you have to go in and acknowledge those nuggets of truth and rescue them. So if you're in some rabbit hole, 9/11 truth in that rabbit hole, and you see some picture of debris that was, from 9/11, and there's no dispute really that it came from 9/11 or it was part of the building destruction and whatnot, you need to rescue it and figure out how was it created. You also have to recognize that most organized disinformation has built-in self-destruct mechanisms. They don't want it hanging around for more than a couple decades. Eventually, they do want the truth coming out, but in a couple decades, most of the perpetrators will be dead, or they'll go on to other things, and we won't be thinking about it. But you can tell that some of the reports, because they had scope limits right in their hypothesis, right in their mission statement, they had a scope limit that practically made it invalid from the get-go. When you look into it, shoddy sampling is another problem. And then, from shoddy samples, for only 3 samples and then extrapolating to be, overbroad explanations for what it couldn't be, those are other clues that, of the self-destruct mechanism built inside the disinformation vehicle. A big one, however, has been lies by omission, expected topics that weren't present, and, as I mentioned before, logical research paths that were not explored. So various actors end up having to put their reputations on the line and produce reports that are faulty. And we can speculate into the reasons for that. Threats to their employment and livelihood, to their reputations, their very health and well-being, and maybe that of their families was put on the line, because when the powers that be, want some message out there, they'll use all things at their disposal. And that's part of the reason why I've been quiet all these years. Other motivations, of course, is patriotism and national security and following orders. They felt like they were doing their part. But sometimes, they had a guilty conscience. So that's where Easter eggs come from. And that's why it behooves us to look for them. Something else to remember is that any orchestrated disinformation premise will never legitimately attack or discredit any other disinformation premise. And by legitimately attack, it means to actually go in and acknowledge nuggets of truth from competing premise and extracting it and having their own premise describe it, saying that, well, hey, your premise has this piece of evidence. My theory can also explain it too. They don't do that. They don't go into any other disinformation premise to debunk it or to grab nuggets of truth. And another reason for that is that I think, while that's speculation, that if you have two different competing disinformation premises, like Dr. Woods do, or like nanothermite, eventually in the PSYOPs chain of command, it'll narrow down to one person who's, has two different groups, two different divisions doing this. And, they don't want to undermine themselves. So if they are benefited by having disinformation premises, even blatantly stupid ones, living longer than they really should. Sorry, I'm running out of breath here because I'm excited about this presentation. At any rate, here's more Easter eggs. Dr. Cheyenne Sundar from NIST gave us a really good one. He was talking about explosions. He was talking about chemical explosives and how they would have been deafening within half a mile, and because, or even a quarter mile. And because hearing loss was not one of the ailments of first responders and survivors, he practically debunks all forms of chemical explosives right there, and it's valid. Dr. Stephen Jones, he said at different points, nanothermite was mixed with something having more brisance, such as RDX. He mentioned later on, something maintained the hotspots, not just nanothermite. Now, there's the two repeated quotes from Dr. Griffin and Dr. Wood, but they're important. I mean, I got to keep putting them out there that, fundamental to the scientific method is that none of the relevant evidence should be ignored. And Dr. Wood's book has a ton of evidence. And then at the end, I've included an Easter egg from Mr. Chandler. He said, and this is from a video, and I'll show you that part of the video. What we are actually seeing here is the falling section of the building turning to dust before our eyes. That right there is a nugget of truth. And because, David Chandler in that video doesn't actually explain what caused that, that becomes, an Easter egg. I mentioned before black hole Easter eggs. And I mentioned before about, in real life, we can tell if a black hole is there because of the gravitational effects it has on neighboring bodies. In 9/11, we can see it in reports and we can see it in various premises. And the reason they went with this attitude of, let's not even talk about it, because if anybody in the public, if the general public gets a whiff that 9/11 had any form of nuclear involvement, it could have meant, first of all, like an overreaction abroad. We would have nuked the hell out of the Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq. And they needed to stop that because, they had Iraqi oil, they had natural gas in Afghanistan, they had heroin in Afghanistan. They also needed to stop Saddam Hussein from going off of the dollar standard, the petrodollar, I believe. He wanted to change that. So they couldn't have nuclear weapons be there as a cause. Plus, they don't want to reveal to the means and methods of the U.S. military to USA's non-allies. In fact, they don't even want to tell their own allies. But of course, anybody who's astute would see, the energy involved there was significant and, just isn't implemented overnight or, even in a short period of time. It also shows what the U.S. was willing to do in terms of crassness and the fact that, we used depleted uranium weapons against Iraq. I mean, that's another hint that, hey, the same psychopaths, who were leading this war also were, willing to do that on ourselves to get there, in for a penny, in for a pound. For Silverstein, who owned, the World Trade Center complex, this is paraphrased from the movie Fields of Dreams, where Kevin Costner builds a baseball field in his cornfield. But paraphrased is, if you rebuild over the nuked WCC complex, ain't nobody gonna come. Because, if any whiff that 9/11 had nuclear components, even if they could prove, and actually they actually did prove that it wasn't, it was a low radiation event, still New York could have had a mass exodus. And of course, rising public awareness of 9/11 nukes could have major figurative nuclear fallout on the credibility of a lot of people, and we can have that in our discussion. I think I'll just go on here. I need to talk about cognitive dissonance quick, because we are all, I'm assuming the audience of this presentation, we're all 9/11 truthers, and so sometimes we look down on those who are not 9/11 truthers and say that they have cognitive dissonance. And of course they do, because if any questioning of 9/11 questions who they voted for, who they supported, the questions their patriotism, it questions, sometimes they have children or whatnot who volunteered for the military because of the lies of 9/11. So they're not going to question it. But what we need to realize is that inside the 9/11 truth movement, there's a lot of people with cognitive dissonance. They're blinded by their own objectivity. They say to themselves, oh, I've already questioned the official conspiracy theory, therefore I'm already enlightened and open-minded. But that's not always the case. Sometimes they were blinded by science. They were blinded by PhDs who infiltrated the 9/11 truth movement and led them astray. They put their thumb on the steering wheel so that we wouldn't look certain places, so that we would, not even consider it, because, hey, the PhD told us. And of course, if they've been busy championing some sort of 9/11 premise for years, it questions, all that time. Did they waste 10 years of their lives championing some premise that I might prove false in this presentation? So we need to be cognizant of that. And by the way, that's the cognitive dissonance is what prevents sincere truthers from going outside the consensus 9/11 premise. But if it's an insincere truther, it's really agendas that prevent them from looking outside. That's how you can tell them apart, that they're insincere, is because they don't legitimately consider what you bring to the table. They don't consider beyond their holy book, Dr. Woods, where did the towers go? So at any rate, I just snapped my fingers. I'm going to begin some Masonic hypnotic suggestion. So I want you guys to assume for the rest of this presentation, or until you're told later, that what I'm going to talk about, or that fourth generation nuclear weapon premise, is valid. Now, the reason you'll be able to make this assumption right now at the beginning is because we're going to prove it true by the end. But you should know that it is already won. The black hole treatment, and not being legitimately debunked already, and it's not even acknowledged, kind of makes it win by default. Also, I've been building this premise up for years. They could see it coming, and they could have had a response to the nuggets of truth that I rescued and combined into this new premise. So, and also, if you assume now from the get-go that my premise is true, it will help with cognitive dissonance that you might experience later. What we're going to do in this presentation, though, it's to be done, is we're going to validate the assumption. And we're going to do that by hunting for Easter eggs through the 9/11 record. We're going to expose weaknesses in the popular 9/11 premises. We're going to create voids in 9/11 understanding. But because we're making this assumption, we're going to fill it with that assumption that we then prove at the end. So let's start off with an Easter egg from this. Now, here's where. Can you guys see this other screen? What screen are you guys seeing?
Easter eggs from NIST / FEMA.
All right, well then I'll change this. So here, give me a second here. I'm now going to share a different thing here. So now I'm sharing my browser. Should be sharing my browser. Do you guys see a fireman here?
Yep.
All right, so here's a video from NIST. Now, there's several. We're going to look at one particular example, but I'm going to start at the beginning because there's something right at the beginning that is very interesting. Oops. We're already 20. It's actually beyond where I want to be. Okay, so you guys are clear on what you're looking at. This right here is part of it's all. It doesn't matter where it is in the structure, whether it was a center box column or whether it was on the wall assemblies. I think this was a center box column. But what has happened here is that it has become so hot that the welds along here failed. I mean, you had to get it up to really high temperature for that to fail. Not only did the welds fail, but this piece here it looks like it's just sagging, like it got so hot, like a piece of Hershey's chocolate, and melted and is out of shape. So when you look at this piece of evidence here or other evidence in here, whatever 9/11 theory you're championing has to address this evidence. And when I look at this evidence and I ask, well, where was NT placed to cause heat like this? And I presented this to people who champion nanothermite, and they can't answer the question. But in fact, they don't. They don't even address anything from this video. But this was not the main piece of evidence I wanted to show. The one I want to show is at like 28. So let me skip over there. 52. I think it's. Well, that's 38. Let me go. My computer sometimes runs out of memory, and I don't always see what's on there. So here we go. So it's in a second that it'll. So whoops. More like 20 seconds. Oops. Here we go. It's right around here. Right. So before I start this right here, what we're seeing is a hollow box column of a wall assembly. Wall assembly were created by 3 hollow box columns that were connected together by spandrels. This box column was hit by something really hard during the demolition and has a gash over a third of its length. So, and that's what we're going to see here. It's concave because it was so hot that it kind of melted in. What we're seeing here is that that this piece of wall assembly got so hot that something else was able to slice it as if it were butter. And it was so hot that after it was sliced, these pieces here kind of caved in, melted.
Nanothermite can't do that.
Well, the question is, where was nanothermite positioned to make this whole piece so hot to do that? Nanothermite doesn't do that. Nanothermite's an incendiary. It cuts things, but it wouldn't heat this whole wall assembly piece up so that another piece that wasn't hot could just slice it. So there's this piece here. Let's see what else he has to say. I don't think it needs to go much further than this. And by the way, when he said it went through the spandrel, that's a thicker piece of the wall assembly. So anyway, this is one piece. I have this on my website listed. I'll have it in my presentation, but I want to jump forward to like 123 for a moment. It's about in here. So here's a bunch of pieces, wall assemblies, but this is going to show a feature. So you see how this is a wall assembly, but you see how this is kind of wavy? It indicates that this experienced a lot of heat, enough so that it made the steel weakened. Also in this video, you'll see steel doobies, and that's where like this is wrapped up as if it were, a bunch of asparaguses with, with the spandrels being rubber bands around it. This video, I mean, there's all sorts of videos out there, and I'm not gonna go into all sorts of details of what's in here. I'm just showing some things that I noticed when I watched it. But everybody should watch it, and you should be looking at it saying, well, hey, how does my premise answer that? Now, let me see. There was something at 144 one, as long as I got this up. Let's see, where is that? Well, yeah, 143. I need to go a little bit further. 144. Yeah, here's an example of a what I call a steel doobie. Let me turn off his volume. So again, it's a wall assembly that got so hot that the spandrels weakened and it wrapped in on itself. But we're also seeing something here that's unique that I need to point out. You see how the video camera is starting to fail on us? There you see more examples of, what I call the steel doobie. But you're also seeing interference on the videotape, and that ends up being a huge clue of radiation. Let me just, there's another place, as long as I'm 139, where's that? It's like we have real-time radiation examples. 139, and when it really, I think at 157, we see it really freaking out. Let me see, where's that? Point is that NIST and FEMA had the best cameras possible, and for them to, and the filmer, oh, you hear something, he's looking at a screw, and the interference gets more and more because of his position, the camera's relationship to this radiation thing. You can see it starting, the film starting to mess up. Videotapes were extremely susceptible to radiation. Digital cameras, not as much, but if you're paying attention, you can still see it on digital cameras. But videotapes just really freak out. And the guy that was running the camera wouldn't even notice until he played it back later, which explains why a lot of the films about the debris was slow walked, delayed for many years. I didn't even see this for lots of years. There's something at 144, was it? Well, I don't need to go into that. Let me stop this share here. Let me go back to my presentation. And, here we are. Share. So, at any rate, I was showing you the example that I had here, this box column that had a gash along 1/3 of its length. And I had questions here, does a given 9/11 theory have a viable explanation for the anomaly? And if so, where was that mechanism located? How was it installed and configured? How was the mechanism used, timed in terms of sequence and whatnot? Or did they not explain it at all? Is it a complete black hole? Is there no attempt to explain how, like nanothermite was positioned to create that gash? Again, here it is, Dr. Dave Ray Giffen. None of the relevant evidence should be ignored. So let's see here. We'll go to the next one. So let me see if I can push this out of the way. How do I get this? My damn control is in my way. Oops, can you guys see, or did I cut it off? There we go. So I'm going to nuke nanothermite as the primary means of WTC destruction. We already saw the evidence in those videos. Nanothermite has no explanation for just those two or three examples, but there's a ton of examples. But it is an incendiary, not an explosive. That's key. So when Stephen Jones, who's the discoverer and founder of nanothermite and his dust samples, when he was cornered on this, he said, well, nanothermite must have been mixed with something having more resistance, like RDX. And of course, when you bring up the example of, the hot spots, they have a couple of good papers where they say, hey, there are these 5 hot spots or spikes in the release of gases. We can attribute those to nanothermite. But when cornered on it, he said something else maintained the hot spots, not just NT. And so it's a black hole in the sense that there was no effort or encouragement of others to retest the dust samples for that something else. I should also point out that as far as I know, the energetic flakes were only found in Dr. Jones's samples. The U.S. government geological survey on the dust report doesn't talk about energetic flakes. Neither does the R.J. Lee report, just Paul Lloyd. There's a lot of reports out there that analyze the dust and don't have that. But what was found in all reports was a significant percentage of tiny iron spheres, and those require a high energy source to create. Now, so what Dr. Jones did and others did is, they said that, hey, let's assume that the reason those iron spheres are there is because NT had a byproduct, which is iron, when it burned. And so Dr. Herrick did some calculations and figured out, well, if you assume that was the byproduct, then the oxygen in the steel, et cetera, he came up with a really large number that, would need to have been installed in each tower in order to achieve, what they're asking here. But then, you got the underground, hot spots in the rubble that burn for months. And just doing the high school math on this, NT has a burn rate of, 1,100 feet per second, and RDX has a burn rate that's even higher, 31,000 feet per second. So, and there were many hot spots. They burned for many weeks. If you simplify this simple high school math chemistry equation down to just one hot spot that burned for 4 weeks, that's 1,411,000 blah, blah, blah seconds. Okay, so what you do, you put that into, let's just, for the sake of discussion, pack it into an imaginary garden hose and ignore the diameter for a minute. The reason you'd pack it in a garden hose is, to make it be like a fuse so it didn't burn up all at once. If you to get a hot spot to burn this long, 4 weeks, NT would be, a garden hose that's 226,000 miles long. RDX is, 7 million miles long. That's, and when you mix the two together, okay, so you got something in between. And if you assume salting, even if it was just N,000 miles, and assuming, a really thin garden hose of only an eighth of an inch, that's a massive amount of material. And that is what's really worse about that is that is unspent from its original purpose of supposedly, pulverizing the towers. This is above and beyond what Dr. Herrick calculated. It doesn't fly. Certainly not as the primary means of destruction. And of course, their black hole efforts was that, when Dr. Wood's book was presented, say, hey, we've got some evidence in here. How can NT explain that? They don't even validly look at what's in her book to see, what needs to be addressed by other theories. So now we'll continue on. So this is the real program here. So we just discredited, now thermite. Now what we have to do in our progress to get to validate, my premise of 4th generation exotic nuclear weapons, we've got to go through and essentially discredit some other theories that other people might be believing, like deep underground nukes. So let's start there. This is often called the nuke theory, and a lot of people throw this out. They try to attack my premise. They say, well, the nuke theory is this, but it's very vague. Is it a nuke? Is it a mini nuke? Is it a millinuke? Is it a micro nuke? What are the differences? They don't explain. But according to their theory, it was a single nuclear device per tower planted deep underground and aimed upwards. And because they don't explain the mechanism very well, you have to assume that its blast wave is going to be a hemispherical emission. But when you look at the video evidence of each tower, the destruction originated within the towers near or above the 80th floor, because the whole premise here was that airplane impacts initiated this destruction. And also, there were distinct stages to the destruction, and those could be seen by squibs. And so, but the nuke theory that, were championed by, the Russian agent and by others as sort of a disinformation play, like I say, doesn't talk about the composition of the nuke, fission, fusion, hybrid, fission, fusion, neutron. It doesn't talk about the form of the energy, the heat wave, blast wave, EMP, highly energetic neutrons. It doesn't talk about the path of the energy. It doesn't talk about, if it detonated underground, it doesn't talk about the floors that are between the underground detonation and what we observed in the destruction of the upper floors. The explanation does not match observable evidence. So this premise here, the nuke theory, is, designed to be self-debunking. And Dr. Woods, even debunks it because, she says, hey, there's undisputed evidence of the undamaged bathtub. And, she talks about, there's three or four out of the 7 subway lines were obstructed, but not all of them were. And she also points to seismic evidence, which, with conventional first through third generation nuclear devices, that is something important to consider. But at any rate, what are some of the Easter eggs from the nuke theory? One of the first ones, from Dmitry, the former Russian agent, was that allegedly the KGB had somehow obtained the building permits for the towers, the building permits and the plans. And when the skylines of New York City really began to rise, this is like in the 40s and 50s and whatnot, they realized that end of life for buildings was just as important as, building it. Particularly, you need to know how you can disassemble this when it is no longer useful. And what the archives allegedly have is that some of the options for destroying the towers were nuclear. They said, well, hey, whatever state-of-the-art nuclear when these buildings are end of life, we can use that to destroy them. Other nuggets of truth, like from the anonymous physicist, is the concern that using tandem nuclear devices together, if they're just blasting out spherical or hemispherical or whatnot, their neutrons, they're going to foul neighboring devices. So you need more control over that. He also points out to the duration of under rubble hotspots, makes a big deal out of that because it is something that is there, that is pretty obvious, and that NT doesn't easily explain. And then, of course, he also, should put new light onto Dr. Wood's work in that she collects a lot of evidence of nuclear involvement, but lets it get camped under kooky umbrellas or non-conclusions. Heinz Palmer, he's a German technical writer. He's the one that brought my attention the videotape susceptibility to radiation and the digital cameras scintillation, which, basically we have recorded evidence of the debris pile and the Fresh Kills website radiating radiation. Another important nugget of truth, and what gave it even standing that there would be a nuke theory at all, is the U.S. Geological Survey report on the dust, which shows evidence of fission, and then the tritium report, which is, a song and dance showing the evidence of fusion. So let's go to those reports and why they're important, and the black hole treatment. So this particular survey was pretty thorough compared to others. It had many samples from different places, and it seemed to be complete data tables with all the elements that you could imagine, and them all adding up to 100%. But in their plain text, they explain all sorts of elements that they found, but there is a black hole, and that black hole happens to be all of these elements here that Jeff Prager happened to point out. Hey, you've got all these things in the data table, but you don't talk about them. Why don't you talk about them? Why are these things even in the dust? And this graphic here shows you why it's important. Like if uranium is involved with fusion, it has decay elements. It has these decay elements and these decay paths. And these are all found. They're all evidence in the dust that there was a fission process that took place. And chromium, he points out at the bottom, well, that happens to be what they use to put on the casing of it that allows the neutrons to bounce around. So when you see that that's involved, you know that you've got some sort of fission process. So, but this is a black hole. This is like, it is so glaring that they didn't mention these elements as a, explain why they would even be in the dust. That's like an Easter egg for us. Blatant, a sign that why didn't you look here? So as I mentioned before, some of the Easter eggs from this is that the data table seems to be complete, but because they did not provide explanations for those things, you know that there's already admission right off the top, it leads you to question the validity of even the values that they measured. Because if they were trying to hide it, maybe they were trying to juke them down and do some mathematical things to the data. I mean, that's what I would have done if I needed to hide something in the data. I would change it and pawn off percentages onto other elements so that you wouldn't even have those trace elements. But at any rate, spoiler alert, this comes from Jeff Prager. He says, the dust samples provide an unprecedented insight into the actions of a nuclear device. And nuclear weapon scientists such as Dr. Stephen Jones should have seized this data to analyze it and determine exactly what type of device produced it. Let's go on. So there's the tritium report. Now, this is something that is actually really funny in the disinformation realm. That they produced this report. It was scope limited right from the get-go in its mission statement to say that, hey, we're looking into this to see that the tritium could be attributed to radioactive devices that might already be in the tower, the contents of the tower. And they focused on airplane exit signs. And then when that didn't match the expectations, they said, well, maybe it was gun sites because there were weapons, in the WTC complex. And then they said, oh, about timepieces, people having watches with, that you push the button to light up. That's all, RL considered devices. But when you look into their actual report, they had only 2 sampling days, right? And they implied that, and tritium is something that's dissolvable in water. They imply that, the tritium from the 21st was, after much rain and dilution by firefighter efforts, that represents the tritium levels on 9/11. Another area, it's a red flag right there in many ways. Samples were only taken in the runoff from WTC-6. And so, point is, they're measuring water off WTC, but they're trying to explain it away with airplanes that crashed into the towers. I mean, a building away. How is it that, what is the path for tritium from the airplane exit signs from the towers all the way over to WTC-6? And as we're going to see later, this is a spoiler alert for later in the presentation, we're going to see that the reason they measured there is because they knew that these exotic nuclear weapons were also used on WTC-6. So that made sense to measure it there. Now, maybe we can give them a pass for not taking samples around any of the other buildings or hotspots, just because they were hotspots. But they stopped taking measurements when their analysis indicated that levels were well below the EPA threshold for what constitutes a health risk. That was their real purpose, to prove to the world that, hey, didn't matter really what happened, but hey, if there's any radiation there, it's below, any health risk. That's the one, major panic that they wanted to shut off. But, in their report, they redefined trace or background levels to be 55 times greater than they were previously. And that was the deceit that was in from the get-go. And, you need to, why tritium is important, it's a building block of all 4th generation nuclear devices. It's a very rare element. And as Prager pointed out, it shouldn't be found at concentrations 55 times normally what they were in the basement, 11 days after 9/11. And it's a telltale sign of nuclear involvement, in this case, fusion. And I'll explain later why you would see fission, elements of fission and elements of fusion in the evidence. There was another report that was put out that is just as silly in terms of, like they only had 3 samples, 3 representative samples from these places, and they want to extrapolate from those 3 samples to saying that this represents all the dust around the towers. And there were delays, there were other things involved with their sampling that, calls it into question their thoroughness. But they have the same black hole as the U.S. Geological Survey dust samples, in that they show in their data tables, these elements that are, fingerprints for nuclear involvement for fission, but they don't mention it at all. Like uranium is only mentioned twice, once in the methodology section and then once in the data tables. So it's almost like those people who wrote that report knew that they were going to be screwed. So they tried to make it as obvious as possible. We're going to use 3 samples and we're going to, not explain things. We're going to leave this big black hole there so that people know that, hey, powers that be told us not to talk about it. Also, you know, in their report, and maybe they learned from the tritium report, when they start talking about, you know, things being, you know, only at background levels or whatnot, they don't actually provide the measurements of what they measured and what background levels were. They don't give you that so that you wouldn't have the problem that we have with tritium of somebody pointing out that, hey, you know, you've redefined what background level is as we go on. So now we come to Dr. Stephen Jones. Now, he wrote a paper called, and he did this before the nanothermite stuff, by the way, because he needed to take nuclear means off the table so that he could present, you know, an alternative theory. And if he nuked nukes first, then he could, you know, promote nanothermite, and people would be happy with that solution, the filling of the void. Anyway, he accepted, unquestioned and unchallenged, those reports I just discredited. I mean, he should have looked at them and said, hey, man, you only got 3 samples. Hey, you know, what is the path? He didn't, you know, what is the path for the tritiated water? How did it get here? He didn't ask anything. He took them all at face value. And of course, because it was the big move was, hey, this is a low radiation event. He reiterates that it was only trace, you know, as the, you know, the redefined level, and he supports, you know, that it was the goal, that it was a low radiation nuclear weapon, so to speak. Other things that he did that were bad in that paper, he frames the nuclear discussion as large thermonuclear, you know, which is fission fusion bombs, which is, you know, 1st and 3rd generation, but they all have, those type of weapons have large blast waves. And if they have a large blast wave, then the radiation from the fissile elements and whatnot gets spread everywhere. And I mean, he framed them wrong as large weapons, just so that he could take them off the table. But this is all old school. It doesn't talk about anything that might be new. He doesn't mention neutron devices that have been, you know, were discussed in the 1970s. And of course, he doesn't mention any type of exotic nuclear devices and what they'd be. But at any rate, he still has Easter eggs that we can look at. So he asked this question at the end of his paper. You know, how, you know, can components of the WTC mini nuke hypothesis explain how large releases of tritium did not happen on 9/11/2001? So that's like a big malframing there. First off, he doesn't describe what he means by mini nuke. And you know, there's this old quote: if you can get them asking the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about the answers. So here he's trying to frame it, you know, hey, I have to defend mini nukes, when reality, it wasn't mini nukes, it was like late 3rd, early 4th generation nuclear devices. You know, these are tactical, hybrid fission fusion, the fission process, you know, that's evident, as I mentioned before, you know, the dust with uranium and its decay elements, fusion process, you know, that's tritium. And so tritium releases did happen on 9/11. The deceit is framing them as large. And when you start talking about 4th generation nuclear devices, you know, 80% of the nuclear yield is highly energetic neutrons. 20% of the yield is heat wave, blast wave, and EMP. So it's already in a different class of how things get released. Now I bring up here Dr. Andre Gespanner. He's a Swiss physicist. As far as I know, he has not written one word about 9/11. But he did write throughout the decade leading up to 2001, a lot of different papers in, I don't know, 3 or more languages. He wrote a book in 1997 called The Physical Principles of Thermonuclear Explosive, Inertial Confinement Fusion, and the Quest for 4th Generation Nuclear Weapons. But more recently, like in 2005, he had a peer-reviewed, and it was published in a reputable science journal, 4th Generation Nuclear Weapons, Military Effectiveness and Collateral Effects. He did that in 2005. What makes it sort of a, you know, black hole Easter egg is that Dr. Jones wrote his letter in 2007. What, he can't do nuke? I mean, in fact, Dr. Jones had access to, you know, top secret databases that talked about all sorts of devices. He wasn't allowed to use that stuff, But Dr. Andre's work was in the public sphere. It was available to anybody. And he didn't put it into his considerations or research. And Dr. Dr. Wood's book that came out in 2010 has the same failing. She didn't do hardly any work into do research or nuclear research, that they missed this. At any rate, Architects and Engineers for Truth, they had an FAQ number 15 where they try to debunk nuclear weapons. And this premise is also used by Mr. Wayne Cost, or is it Costy? I don't know how he pronounces his name. But anyway, their premise in that FAQ was that various authors claim that nuclear blast caused or contributed to the destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Why does AE 9/11 Truth not endorse this claim? Well, the problem right there, I mean, nuclear blast in their mission statement is the straw man, because blast implies a destructive wave of highly compressed air spreading outward from an explosion. It implies an explosion or explosive firing, especially of a bomb, and it implies a strong gust of wind or air. And obviously, if you're framing it like that, then yes, I have to agree that it would have thrown radioactive material great distances and radiated surrounding buildings and impacted the health of a much larger population, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you have to agree with that, but that's with the framing of nuclear blast. What they omitted from their research is that the fourth generation nuclear devices that I'm talking about, they don't produce a large blast wave. That's less than 20% of its total nuclear yield. And it has to share that 20% with the EMP and the heat wave. And the highly energetic neutrons have a different effect on the materials that they pass through. Jeff Prager's and yeah, here's another thing that their report did. I mentioned before what I consider Jeff Prager's claim to fame, in that he looked at the USGS survey on the dust and he said, hey, you're not talking about these elements here that are clearly indicative of fission process. When A&E did their FAQ number 15, they mentioned Jeff Prager in like the flowing text, and then they do the trick of pushing you into the footnotes to actually figure out why they don't support his claims. And it turns out that they were cherry picking from other reports of Jeff Prager. They don't mention his dust report at all, or his analysis of those concerns at all. And then they character assassinate him in those same footnotes. That they weren't looking at what was important about what Jeff Prager had said ever about nuclear involvement, and they focused on cherry pick nonsense. So what do we have here? This is where we are on the program so far. We've discredited nanothermite, we've discredited deep underground nukes, we've discredited reports that were used to tell us that nukes were involved. We've discredited that report itself. We've also discredited AE 9/11 Truth involvement in trying to steer us away from nuclear involvement. So what's still on our plate here is we got to go after Dr. Judy Wood. So she is the matron saint of 9/11 Truth, and here's her quotes again. You got to listen to the evidence, keep focusing on that evidence, and that is true. And I recommend Dr. Wood's book for these reasons down here. 500 full-colored images in her book. She had this great thing where she shows images of destruction, and then on a map she shows the position and where that person was when they took it, because sometimes when you look at the destruction, you have no idea where you're looking and what you're looking at and what used to be there. And so that was really helpful. She gave us real-world awareness of directed energy weapons, active denial systems, ABL, beams from space. I mean, those are all valid concepts, but they're not necessarily valid in use on 9/11. She also, in her early chapters, because all she really did was repurpose from her website. And in the early days, there were reports that were put out about the pancake theory and the the crushing upper stories. Well, she has early chapters where she debunks those theories, saying, hey, mathematically, that didn't happen. And this was also before there was a lot of, videos produced. But, the one reason why you need to have her book is because it's clever disinformation. It's worthy of study for the nuggets of truth. That's what you have to mine from. By the way, these images here are from Dr. Wood. Here's another image, how does NT explain that this huge support column would be bent into a, like a horseshoe? I mean, in the normal circumstances, you'd have to put this into a blast furnace and would have to be in that blast furnace for a measurable period of time. Maybe it's a dozen seconds, maybe it's a dozen minutes, but it's still a measurable period of time because you have to heat the whole volume of the material in order to get it to do this. And here's this meteorite. Well, we can get into that later. These are great things about Dr. Judy Wood. But the disclaimer is this is my debunking of her book. Dr. Judy Wood drops lots of dangling innuendo, connects no dots, draws no conclusions, and provides shoddy research into both DO and nuclear considerations. So I mentioned at the beginning of this book that sometimes you can spot disinformation because somebody who's promoting disinformation premise A, they will never legitimately and thoroughly discredit a competing disinformation premise. And of course, there's the black hole where if they don't address the other premise, then they could ignore the nuggets of truth that might be in that competing premise. So here is a good example from another example from AE 911 Truth. They tried to debunk DO, this FAQ number 6. What's your assessment of the directed energy DO hypothesis? And in this case, clearly they were aiming at Dr. Wood and things that, some of the dangling innuendo from her book, but they don't actually go into the book. They didn't reference any text or any images from Dr. Wood's book or website. They gave no indication that they even read such material. They misrepresent and malframe DO as entirely beams from space. And it consumes 40% of its word count promoting nanothermite. As I mentioned before, it failed to legitimately address evidence in Dr. Wood's book. Here's a piece of evidence. This is kind of interesting. This shows an example of the steel doobie. Can you see down here in the left-hand corner? This beam, this wall assembly that's on the side is kind of wrapped in all itself. It's supposed to look like the wall assemblies that it's resting on, but it's not. At any rate, I need to bring up Mr. Cole. When I brought this to their attention, through their website, they had a website there. This was an AE&E, but this is where I don't know where Mr. Cole was active at the time, where he was promoting. It may have been their website, but he wrote to Mr. Chandler, don't even waste your time responding to my concerns about the shoddiness of their research into DO. And then, of course, David Chandler elaborated, and he says, John and I concur that we consider Dr. Judy Wood to be a distraction, a disruption, and one who's promoting theories that are unsupported by evidence and transparently false. And that's where the disinformation is, because she doesn't have any theories in her book. So for them to say that one who's promoting theories that are unsupported by evidence, it proves that they didn't read the book at all, because she has no theories. She just has lots of dangling innuendo. So they're trying to brush off all of her evidence off the table. Yeah, with their last statement, we have no interest in discussing her work further. See, they're not willing to go in there and see pictures like this and try to explain, how does NT explain how this wall assembly got wrapped up into a steel doobie? So anyway, here we are. Now we're going to nuke Dr. Wood's disinformation. As I mentioned before, she connects no dots and draws no conclusions. She's not an end station. She's incomplete. And therefore, whenever I get into discussions with, Woodsian doers, who keep promoting her book, it's like, hey, that's a step backwards. My premise addresses all the evidence from her book and takes it up to the next level. You need to be supporting me. If you keep trying to take the discussion back to her book, you're not going to get anywhere, because, in fact, a lot of her opponents, they champion as one of the benefits of her book is that she doesn't draw any conclusions. It's all about the evidence. Well, if there's no conclusions, then you still have to do some work to find out what the conclusions are. If you look into specifics of her book, she has some DO admissions. There's different forms of directed energy that you can rely on. Most of her stuff had to do with electromagnetic energy. But what she didn't research or purposely left out is that the spectral frequencies conducive for efficiency transmission of destructive energy are not necessarily the spectral frequencies that are conducive for transmission through the atmosphere, and particularly from space. And I have to say this, that I really didn't see in her book where she was promoting beams from space. She was more saying that that is an option. But it was her detractors. It was people like David Chandler and others who said, oh, she's talking about beams from space. And so they go off all on a tangent about that. But beams from space isn't a possibility, really, even with electromagnetic energy, because it needs a source. How do you get that source into space? Maybe, and so they were saying, well, maybe it was solar energy or whatnot, but that's still a massive amount, and it has to go through the atmosphere to the towers and affect what we see there. So that's not going to happen. Also, if we use this premise that it was beams from above or beams from afar, the destruction initiated within the towers. It did not initiate top down through the roof. And we don't see that. I mean, if it was beams from space, you would see it like boring through the roof and all the floors at once. It wouldn't have started at the 80th floor and then worked up to the top and then down. Any type of dew from a distance does not address the duration of under-level hotspots. By that I mean, maybe you could get a beam to heat up, a laser beam, for lack of another word, to heat up a piece of steel. But once the beam is turned off, that piece of steel is going to cool down, and it's not going to still be a hot spot 4 weeks from now. So that's another area where any premises of beams from space or beams from afar falls down. The fact that she allowed dew to be framed as exclusively beams from space or beams from above, that's another area that is bad. I have a point here, that there's a mission from her analysis of dew, and that is dew from within, meaning actually within the buildings. Now, although, a lot of effort is put onto the World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2, where she really makes her case about dew from above is with World Trade Center 4 and World Trade Center 5 and 6. She says, hey, the space beams could do that. And she points to what I have to admit look like boreholes in the buildings and say, hey, it came from above. But in reality, World Trade Center 4 had gold vaults that were in the process of being looted. Now, they don't tell us how much gold was in the vaults before the looting. They don't tell us how much was found in the vaults after the looting, or how much was in the truck that they discovered abandoned in the old subway tunnels, the semi-truck trailer loaded with gold. They don't tell us all those details because that's kind of embarrassing. But that is a clue that it wasn't beams from space, because we'll see later in the images that the destruction kind of ends at street level. It doesn't go below street level because that would foil the gold heist. Also from World Trade Center 4, we learned from the FEMA photographer that its vaults, so the World Trade Center 6 was the customs house. It had vaults in its basement that collected, confiscated guns and drugs and money. I mean, it had all sorts of stuff in the basement. But what the photographer found out was that these vaults were emptied beforehand. There wasn't, they were destroyed, but it was clear that they were emptied before the destruction happened. And that fact actually undermines their premise. When they were measuring tritium off WTC6, they were trying to say that the tritium was associated with weapons, but all the weapons that they were talking about were not in the building anymore. And as I mentioned before, if you're beaming from above, and because it goes at the speed of light, it's hard to stop it once it's bored through, 9 floors or 10 floors, so that it doesn't go below street level. But, again, one of her missions is, dew from within. If you had dew devices that were planted at the ground floor within the structures and aimed upwards, it would not foil the bank robbery that was in place. As I mentioned before, in my own research, when I was unemployed, I took out a library card at my local institution of higher education and went over checked out books and then, articles, and got online to, the various online subscriptions to information that you have access to when you have a library card. And I discovered that she did a really poor job of actually researching Dew, and certainly in researching nuclear weapons in general. And, the omission that she didn't even stumble across Dr. Andre Gispaner is, I mean, that's huge. I have a link to that here, link to it in my presentation. But that whenever I've been in discussions and I've thrown up his work on fourth generation nuclear devices, that's when my discussion opponents go silent. They can't even quote from it and put it back in discussion to prove that they went there to read it, because that is how damning it is. They'd rather give it the black hole treatment and look like fools than address it head on, saying that, hey, that might actually be kind of valid. So here we are. I discredited a bunch of theories, but I'm now moving the goalposts because David Chandler was mentioned. He deserves some time here. So what I like about David Chandler, yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you how much longer? Because we wanted to get to the Q&A and the agenda as well.
Yep, I have to go to slide 51, but the other slides will go faster.
Okay. You think maybe 10 more minutes?
No, probably 20.
Ooh.
But this is important. This is important.
All right. Thank you.
So anyway, we already know about Mr. Chandler, that he has a BA degree in physics, that he got a certificate to teach high school physics, and he put together some really awesome videos on this structure. I'm going to go to one of those videos now, but it's the video where he said, where he analyzed the top 20 floors of World Trade Center 1, and he calculated that the roof fell at a constant 65% gravitational acceleration, that it was suddenly and symmetrical, and that polarization was at the earliest moments. And then, his Easter egg quote, "What we see here is the failing structure in the building turning to dust before our eyes." So we need to go look at that real quick. So I'm going to stop this real quick. I'm going to go back to share. Uh-oh, there it is, share screen. And this time I'll go back to, all right. So let me get out of this real quick. Oops. This is not, this is the old one. Fortunately, I can't see my browser, so I got to move things around. Here we go. This is Dave Chandler's video on the destruction of the towers. So listen carefully.
I don't hear anything.
You guys don't hear anything?
No.
Oh. All right. Well, let me try. You heard? Let me. Can you hear it now?
No.
Well, it's not so far. You guys see here the picture. You can go out and watch the video. I have the links in my presentation. But he's essentially saying here that, hey, this turns to dust, but he doesn't ever explain why. In fact, the video kind of ends before he even speculates, well, what could have caused that? What could have caused it to suddenly turn to dust? So, okay, so we'll go back to my presentation. Give me a second here. Oops, share. Okay. You can see my presentation again. So this is where he gave, his Easter egg. So he knows that something needs to be explained there, yet we don't ever see that explanation. What I find interesting is that, although he has he's maybe valid saying that nuclear physics was never his expertise, but he knows enough to know where to look, and he knows how to understand the material if he were to look. And whenever it was presented to him, he kept saying, "Oh, it's outside of his knowledge," and he would put no effort into it. I went and I gave him Dr. Wood's book, and I didn't realize that that something that I consider disinformation could cause so many figurative bloody noses, just because somebody wouldn't look at it. I didn't hold them to this premise like I did Yeah, another disinformation warrior. But I told him, when I gave him this book, hey, just give it a fair and objective reading. Mine it for nuggets of truth. And I said, when you're done with it, if Mr. Cole doesn't have it, give him your copy or pay it forward. That's what I was trying to do. From them both, I wanted to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And they didn't do it. And like, I don't know, it was like 6 months later. I don't know when it was. I can look on my website, where I collected my words. And we were in discussion, probably on Craig's group, Truth and Shadows, and he admits that he didn't really read it. I was incredulous. I said, a 500 book, with 500 large images, and all you can come up with in your good, bad, and ugly book report was to supposedly debunk it in its entirely, was that you started it but you didn't finish it. Now, if you didn't finish it, then you can't claim that it's disinformation. You don't even know what's in the later chapters. And I was chiding him like, hey, if one of your students came up to you and said, oh, I started reading the book that you recommended, but I didn't finish it before I gave my book report, that's not going to really fly. And of course, Chandler responded and said, well, yeah, that's right. You sent it to me on your own volition. But he admits in here that he says, I see Dr. Judy Woods as baseless. Now, what's important about that is, again, clever disinformation that Dr. Judy Wood's book is. She doesn't have any theories. So in order for him to say that theories are baseless means that he didn't read it and doesn't really understand it. And he certainly, when he says here at the last sentence, I won't waste my time. Don't waste your time trying to change me. I'm not trying to change him into a Woodsian doer. I'm just trying to get him to acknowledge the evidence. And it goes on, where he would promote over time that, oh, Dr. Drudes is, is a strong man and, would fail by justification, which I find to be pretty ludicrous because in that video we hear him mocking he's mocking justification here, but in his video he says, well, we actually see here is the falling section burning to dust, turning to dust before our eyes. At any rate, when they're discussing this, they don't discuss the steel properly. Yes, wall assemblies and internal columns fell in normal lengths, but what was missing from the debris pile were the metal pans and the supporting trusses for each floor, and the floor content itself. Office furnishings, file cabinets, things that you normally expect on a floor to be there. They don't discuss it properly, and of course, they never talk about how NT could have achieved it. And of course, he and Jonathan Cole go on to malign Dr. Wood and whatnot. This is like two disinformation premises going at each other. But he's there associating with holograms, and he mischaracterizes it as space beams, and it reflects about how little objectivity he really had, because there is certainly a lot in Dr. Wood's book that can be done. I mean, the fact that she connects no dots and has no conclusions means it's disinformation, but it's got great evidence, and those things need to be acknowledged. And they didn't do the job that they stood up to take on. But he does have good things. Can't see how do I move my controls out of the way? I don't know why. Here we are. So when he discourages things, when he calls things disinformation, or when he calls things exotic nuclear weapons and tries to mock it, he doesn't give any details to tell you how he came to that conclusion. And again, there's no acknowledgement of any nuggets of truth from with any disinfo or anything that he's labeled disinfo. There's no attempt to rescue nuggets of truth and to get, like the consensus 9/11 theory to address it. And of course, here Dr. Griffin is going to give him a black eye from the grave. None of the relevant evidence should be ignored. And that's precisely what Mr. Chandler did. But even after I had moved on beyond her, it took me like 2 passes through her book before I figured out, well, hey, there's really no conclusions here. There's just a lot of evidence. And I started developing my own theories, and these were some, the titles of some of them. There were times when, I would send out emails just to the few people that I know, said, hey, can you give me feedback on this? I sent this to Mr. Chandler. He knew it was coming. I provided links to it. Hey, this is and he even, encouraged me in the sense that, well, hey, if you think nuclear weapons were involved, why don't you take it upon yourself to make a case for it? So I did, and then he won't even review it, won't even read it. Recently, like we're talking October, I submitted my very premise, the one that I'd link here, to that new, International Center for 9/11 Justice. where he's involved and other people like Wayne Cost are involved. I submitted my article and I've gotten no feedback, no debate, no publication, nothing. But, you know, Mr. Chandler has other issues. Mr. McKee calls him, you know, he's part of the 9/11 Pentagon cabal or whatever. That's a whole other rabbit hole that, I mean, he got his truther cred from supposedly, I mean, from his videos on 9/11, and I give him a lot of chops for that. But he didn't take it far enough, and he purposely steers away from where we should be thinking. And then, of course, he did the same thing with Pentagon, and that's what Craig McKee can enlighten you about. Oops. So here we are. I've discredited all these theories. Now it's time to quickly validate the initial assumption, which is that fourth generation exotic nuclear weapons cause, you know, the destruction of 9/11. So again, here's the link to my website. I'm going to go through these sections here, but something to keep in mind is that, you know, I've tried to shop this around to anybody that I knew, you know, to get valid criticism, and it's been consistent across 9/11 groups and 9/11, you know, truther celebrities, that they would ignore it. They would black hole my comments. They would, you know, delete me. There was no acknowledgments of any nuggets of truth or applicability. Well, many times there's just no engagement to legitimately address. And then they would use disinformation strawman. You know, they would frame things as deep underground nukes or as Woodsian do, that, you know, trying to put things in a different light. But this is an important slide here for everybody, talking about what nuclear weapons are and how they work. The first generation nuclear devices were fission devices. Basically, you take a conventional charge that explodes and throws fissile material together. It makes an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. It consumes only a fraction of this fissile material, but then, you know, most of its energy is in this thermal heat and blast waves, and it blasts and disperses the fissile material in the environment, and it's really bad. Second and third generation devices, what they use is they have a fission stage, which is just what I explained, but it's only designed to create the heat for the fusion stage. And the fusion stage releases most of its energy, like 95% of its energy, as a thermal pulse and blast effects. And therefore, you know, it's spreading badness throughout the realm. And that's exactly what Dr. Stephen Jones debunked in his paper, you know, these weapons here. But he made no mention of neutron bombs. And how I got onto the topic of neutron bombs, you know, because it has a fission stage just like thermonuclear, you know, is to create the heat for fusion and the fusion stage. But where the fusion stage is different is that it allows the neutrons to escape instead of, you know, having them stay in the kernel and have an uncontrolled, much larger chain reaction. And I was looking at this and said, hey, it releases only 20% of its energy as the thermal heat and blast wave. So I was thinking, a screwdriver. You can use a screwdriver to unscrew a screw, but you can also use it to open a paint can and to chip wood and to scrape things and do other things. You can use a screwdriver in an unconventional fashion. Why can't you use a neutron bomb in an unconventional fashion? You get, you know, a 20%, you know, thermal heat wave and stuff, and then you could throw away the neutrons. I mean, that's what my thinking was. But then I ran across Dr. Andre Desfano's work, and it's really, he talks about, really, it's late third and early fourth generation nuclear devices. It's just like the neutron bombs, but the energy is released in a targeted fashion, not in this, you know, a sphere or a hemisphere. It's released, you know, as a cone, let's say. That would be a simple shape to obtain. It's in the category of do, so Dr. Judy Wood should be all over it. It's next generation Woodsian do. It powers itself. And the energy that it releases of the neutrons produces a very different effect on the things that it passes through. So now we're talking about Dr. Andre Desfano. This is a link here that people should be aware of, because this isn't, you know, me talking. It's like stuff that's research that's out there. This was peer reviewed, and it's gone through several revisions. It's published in a reputable science journal. He's got a really long CV. And he hasn't ever been discredited or debunked, but he also hasn't ever been addressed in terms of, you know, people in the 9/11 truth movement who, you know, who would have the responsibility to research this and address it. and didn't. But these bullet points here are essentially from Dr. Gisponer, where he says that fourth generation nuclear weapons are primarily very intense sources of penetrating radiation. They produce direct work on a target. They induce a very different response within their targets. And then he lists, some of the things that you could achieve, but one right off the bat, you can heat the volume of a material. Well, guess what these are? These are, arches or sags. This is evidence from Dr. Judy Wood that she's collected. But in order to create an arch like this, a smooth arch like this, under normal circumstances, you need a blast furnace. And as I mentioned before, it needs to be in that blast furnace for a measurable period of time. Yet here these guys are, the volume of their material was heated up almost instantaneously to a point where the material was pliable and could bend. The main effect, though, is, I think, ablating, where the leading edge of a material vaporizes so quickly it causes a shock wave in the rest of the material that blows it apart. This is what I envisioned happened to like the metal trusses and the metal pans while they were gone. Now the concrete, think of concrete has trapped water in it. When these neutrons pass through the material, they're highly energetic neutrons. The form of energy that they left behind usually is in the form of heat. In terms of the water molecules, those will turn to steam immediately and blow apart. Well, like in case of concrete, create microfractions everywhere. In case of a body, that's why there were very many remains, because it turned to steam. Your blood turned to steam and went up in smoke, literally. Let's continue on. This is kind of how I envision things going on in the towers. It was multiple devices, and the reason I came up with like this scenario of like 4 devices per detonation level, except for the first one, is this little anomaly here in the picture on the left. You can see the spire. Now, what we see in this picture is this is something that's like 70 or 80 stories high. It's not the full height of the towers, but the fact that this remained, like, you have to ask yourself, why was that part of the destruction sequence? My theory is that because the ignition of these 4th generation nuclear devices was not instantaneous. You had, conventional charge, and then you had the fission stage and the fusion stage. From 0 to full nuclear yield was probably not 0, and they might have even had a duration, in which case you needed a stable platform to be mounted on, and you didn't want it blown out from underneath you. So therefore, you got the spires here. Now, another anomaly that kind of points to this is, we point out regularly, these squibs that we see leading the destruction wave. Well, in a normal, conventional destructions, those squibs would be along the whole floor. I mean, you would see something that was along like even the whole inner core blasting out. You wouldn't see these little things here, but if it's just the ignition of these devices here, it would go out, the face. You would see it, and look at the direction of this cone. I mean, this angle of this cone isn't, accurate. This is just, my ability in in paint. But the destruction of the neutrons, by the time it hits the outer wall assemblies, it's already, kind of dustified the content that's in between. And when it hits those outer walls, that's, 10, 15 floors above where you initially saw those squibs. This is how it could happen. This is just, one scenario, me speculating based on what is in the public record. But again, as we go through the evidence, we already have that evidence. The United States Geological Survey has evidence of fusion in the dust. We have the Paul Loy report that also shows it in the dust. We have evidence of fusion with the Tritter reports, and the whole song and dance of that disingenuous report. And we've got Dr. Stephen Jones giving the black hole treatment to it. And then there's an Easter egg from Dr. Cahill. Now, he's somebody that came to the World Trade Center in early October after the events. So he was late already, but he was sampling the air. He and his crew were sampling the air for things. And something that he discovered, a really big Easter egg, is the presence of coarse materials immediately after days of rain indicated that they were being continually regenerated from a dry, hot source. They weren't resuspended from roadways or other surfaces. So, let me go back a slide. In this scenario where you have multiple devices, again, the fear from the anonymous physicist is that when you have multiple nuclear devices, one device can foul another device, and then it won't reach its full nuclear yield. And any point between nothing and fizzling is a failure. And so, kind of like what we see with various meltdowns of nuclear reactors, a fizzling device could last a long time. So at any rate, he was measuring air quality, and he says that, hey, these metals that we're discovering in the air were being continually regenerated. Would not do that, and how does NT do that? If Dr. Jones admits that NT did not maintain the hot spot, something else happened. So as we go on, again, here's something. These Easter eggs do double duty because they were in the original reports and draft from like the RG Lee group, and then another from Dr. Stephen Jones and his other scientists, where they said things like, the iron particles consisted of 5.8% of the dust. That's a huge percentage when normally it would be like 0.04% of the normal dust. So something, we vaporized a lot of steel, and I'm saying it was the pans and the trusses and building content. But they talk about the temperature of what it takes to reach that. And so here it is already. 3,000 degrees is what was required to get the iron to vaporization so you can create these iron spheres. But Stephen Jones, in his report, he's talking about a completely different element, and that these were found in the devices, and look what temperature he was talking about, even greater than that. And these nuclear devices have the energy to spare. And here's an image from Dr. Wood, the meteor. As I said before, the neutrons passing through this would have a different effect, and it also depends on how far you are away from the ignition point as to the effect of the neutrons on it, because you're passing through multiple floors, it degrades in terms of like the amount of energy it still has to produce damage. Here's, you were all familiar with this. This is sometimes a picture that's used in the NT reports, but hey, this looks more like, a fizzled nuke. Created that and kept it hot. We already saw this video, and I already talked about it, but any source that you look at, this is just a seed, videos or whatnot. You need to have the seed planted in your mind that, hey, maybe nuclear devices can explain it better than other things. But in the videos that I showed you, you got mangled steel wall assemblies and the internal support beams, and then you also have the real-time emission of radiation that you can see registered on cameras. That is pretty important. On my website, when I went through this, I had a section where I talk about each of the towers, and so I'll quickly go through that. Here's an image of the towers. This can be maybe explained. I don't know this is a valid picture, but it could be one of these lower nukes going off, and you can actually see it going through the sides. It captured at the right moment. Something that's important about like this middle picture, first of all, you can see the squibs there, but you can see things here that are, it almost looks like they're disintegrating. Like I say, the concept that I have is that when the neutrons went through like concrete, and the water molecules in there expanded to steam, it created a lot of microfractures. And as long as it was still in place, in proximity to other concrete, so to speak, on its floor, it would stay in place. But once it started falling, the outer edges started peeling off, and you can see things here like concrete, peeling off. It was fracturized, microfractures from the middle, and it's peeling off. Also, the wall assemblies were heated, up above in these upper areas were heated from neutrons going through it. So anything attached to them, you can see it kind of burning off. Here's other pictures. Again, you can see this wall assembly. Why is it streaming what seems like smoke, but really it's kind of like dust? It was things that were attached to it. It's almost as if this was a burner of a stove that got heated up, instantaneously, and things that were on the stove before it was turned on, all of a sudden are being burned off. This picture on the right is extremely relevant because in this picture, it shows one of the towers, and the upper floors of that tower were leaning to the side. Newtonian physics tells us that, hey, once it started its angular momentum, this upper block, if it would have remained a cohesive whole, should have rolled off to the side, path of least resistance, and it would have creamed other neighboring buildings. But before it got too far from here, again, in my premise, these other devices came and turned this to dust. Little dust particles still had angular momentum, but not as a cohesive whole. So they essentially were able to fall down into the tower's footprints. Here's other speculation. This is, just stupid. This is really just simple, paint drawings, and the number of devices is not accurate, and the angle of the cones is not accurate because I don't know. But this shows you that, a premise of how we don't like this here, the top right, this could be like what you would see with World Trade Center 4 and how its main edifice got zapped. But in looking at it after, drawing these, I realized that maybe it was more devices. What's important about this one here on the left, this is World Trade Center 7. And as you guys, if you recall any of the videos of World Trade Center 7, there was this like penthouse area on World Trade Center 7 that started collapsing first before, it went into the building. Now, if you had one device here that happened to hit that magic column 47, and then you had other devices, many other devices, I didn't draw them, but if you had many other devices aimed in, kind of like these were, that's how you could, and this is all like on the ground floor. So a couple of, I don't know, half a dozen guys carrying, 2 duffel bags apiece, a couple times, trips, they could easily plant devices on the lower level in a short period of time. And again, World Trade Center 7 was a secure facility, but if they did this all off the ground level, they could have taken out what we see here. You see what the effects were. I'm not saying that the range was completely up to the top there, but again, in any demolition, you take out the lower levels and then you let gravity do the rest. World Trade Center 4, these pictures come from Dr. Woods, and they also come from 9/11 Revisionist, his Substack. You can see here where the main edifice was and that it's completely gone. Remember, World Trade Center 4 had gold vaults underneath it. Now, I suspect the gold vaults were under the portion that weren't hit by devices. But you can see here, like there's a big, in the lower left, big pieces of the tower, but they weren't big enough to knock over this little remnant of the main edifice. My speculation, and this is not complete or accurate, the angles devices, the number of devices, but it shows you how devices could be angled that would take out the material that you see here, yet still leave a corner of like the main edifice. Like in the lower right-hand corner, that picture in the lower right-hand corner has a corner of the, well, you can see it in the upper one left, and and you can also see in these pictures that, hey, when the towers landed on here, not only do you not see significant debris from the towers, but you don't see any debris from the 9 stories of World Trade Center 4. And also, you can see here the destruction. Well, this isn't the cleanup phases, but the destruction didn't go below street level. In these earlier pictures, you can also see that it didn't really go below street level. So let's go on. World Trade Center 5. In this picture here on the top left, you can see World Trade Center 7 when it's still intact. World Trade Center 5 is down there, but you've got this whole street of torched cars. How did that happen? And I say that, that's when World Trade Center 5 went off. Here's World Trade Center 5. You can see pictures of it. And this actual picture, although it comes from Dr. Wood, it debunks the premise of beams from above. See, her premise was she looked at these holes and said, hey, these are nice boreholes that go pretty far down, and they came from above. But in this hole here to the right, there's an overlapping piece of the roof. If there was a beam from above, it would have cut through this piece of roof first and then bored into the building. But if the device was in the building and aimed upwards, it could conceivably weaken and create this hole here without affecting this overhang piece that still remained, or somehow it got blown up out of the way and then settled back down. Now I have a video here, so let me stop, because this is an important video. Let's see here. Go back to sharing. Okay, share. Oh, let me stop this one here.
What is happening?
Oops, this is not the right video though. Okay, so here we go. I happen to have it in Facebook. I saved it there because Facebook has a weird place, where it saves its image. It's not like YouTube where I have a URL to it. So We're gonna start at like 116, but this is in advance. Hopefully you guys can hear what he's saying. Can you hear what he's saying?
No, can't hear anything.
Okay. Well, it's not so big. Let me first expand this out though.
Is your volume on your computer up?
Yeah, it is, but what he's saying it really isn't important. Let me go back to because I'm going to point out what I think is important. Let me go back a little bit further. So what we're going to see here is the tower behind is disintegrating, and you see it spewing dust, and World Trade Center 7 is in the middle. Now I start advancing the video, and you see dust there. Off to the left, you're going to see over here, you can see the debris coming down. And that's important. But then we're going to see, and what I assumed from the get-go when I first saw it was that, hey, this debris is coming down, this is coming and bouncing off the ground and coming back up. But that's really not what happens, because what we see bouncing back up isn't bouncing back up. It's a whole new content. Look at this. There's going to be a whole bunch of new content exploding from within here in the next second. Watch, here it comes. Here it comes. This is when World Trade Center 5 and World Trade Center 6 got zapped. Those holes in the building, you guys like me to show it again? And also this video here, if you go to my Facebook wall where I have this, they focus all your attention on the explosions up here, saying, hey, notice there is an explosion. Most of the time the explosion is muted. You don't hear it. But likewise, when it gets to this lower level of destruction, here, you don't hear the explosions for this either. That's because these fourth generation nuclear devices aren't pushing around air, they're emitting highly energetic neutrons. So the effect is completely different. So let me go back. I'm rushing through this. Don't worry about it, guys. Let me go back to share. I just want to point that out because, hey, we do have evidence of World Trade Center 5 and World Trade Center 6, blowing up, and the devices going off and creating these boreholes in there. Here's, off to the right here, you can see that this is new content and more content than the dust that was falling down. So let me go on in this presentation here. So here's World Trade Center 6. Can you see the big boreholes in here? This kind of the diameter of some of these indicates that I'm totally off base in what I drew in paint, because it was a lot narrow. Like here's the inside of World Trade Center 6, and you can see that it created, it has a hanging piece of this is structure, but the fourth generation nuclear device missed that. When its neutrons were emitted, it missed that portion, but it did cut in a nice, almost straight line. And what it didn't cut, there was no support for it. So that's why you see a lot of hanging debris there. But the damage goes down only to the ground level. It doesn't really go below that. Even with the debris from World Trade Center 1 on top of it. I mean, it doesn't add up why all those floors would be suddenly gone. So now let's continue on. So let's recap some of our Easter eggs. So Dr. Cheyenne Sundar hinted that it wasn't conventional explosives because it would have been much louder. Dr. Stephen Jones, who was giving us lots of hints, saying that, hey, something maintained the hotspots, not just NT. So it was up to us to look for what those something else's were. Dr. Griffin says, hey, we can't be ignoring the relevant evidence. Dr. Judy Wood says, hey, I got lots of evidence here. Look at my evidence. And then, of course, Mr. Chandler is saying that, hey, this stuff turns to dust before our eyes. But he doesn't tell us what did that. So again, this is what we've gone through now, and we just validated the initial assumption. So based on that, I can end the hypnosis that I started at the beginning. That was mostly just a joke, because now we have proved and validated our initial assumptions. We know that fourth generation nuclear devices were involved. We don't have to assume it anymore. We did the Easter egg hunt through the 9/11 record. We exposed the weaknesses of the adjacent 9/11 premises. We exposed the weaknesses in the nuke debunking that they tried to foist upon us. And we showed that these fourth generation nuclear devices address a wider swath of evidence than the other theories. This is what I call next level 9/11 understanding. Going forward, it is okay for you to believe and champion 9/11 fourth generation exotic nuclear weapons. And you need to nuclear energize your 9/11 truth efforts. If you're doing an RFC to NIST or justice in court, even if your premise or why you're taking them to court doesn't have anything to do with the destruction of the World Trade Center, if you don't have in your hip pocket what the true elements of the destruction were, you're going to cause your own case to fail. Because all they have to do, is ask you questions, and if what is in your hip pocket is NT, which is the 9/11 consensus theory, I've already debunked it in this presentation, and all your opposition has to do is go and find out what I wrote to debunk it, and they can present that to you, because now thermite does not go the distance. I do have one last slide that's very important. This is your protection. You guys are 9/11 truthers. I'm assuming that you're sincere. Many of you, if you were personally involved in the public or in the online 9/11 discussion, you might have been duped by clever 9/11 disinformation by infiltrated 9/11 truth groups. You might have even actively promoted such disinformation, in your spirited debate. This is your protection. Your protection is to evolve and apologize. Everybody, you're all on mute, so you can repeat after me. In light of this new 9/11 analysis that collects and explains a wider swath of relevant 9/11 evidence, which I may have been inexplicably ignored or been unaware of in the past, I change my opinion on 9/11 demolition causes. I acknowledge that fourth generation nuclear devices comes closer to the truth. I apologize for having led the public astray with various 9/11 premises now proven faulty that I may have championed in the past. I furthermore promise to acknowledge and promote fourth generation nuclear devices in my future 9/11 efforts, using my own experience with faulty premises to demonstrate how clever, orchestrated, and coordinated disinformation can dupe. So I thank everybody here for your objectivity. I thank you also for letting me go over time on this. That is the end of my presentation. I hope that I convinced you without the hypnosis.
Well, it's a lot to absorb. Thank you. Thank you very much. I did want to mention I happened to talk to Ted Walter today about your submission of your paper. And he has guidelines that limit it to 2,000 words. So, but yours went over 4,000. So if you could revise it to under 2,000 words, it would be considered. So just to let you know about that. Also, you had mentioned that the bathtubs were unaffected. Did I get that right? Did I catch that right?
Yes, you did. In fact, this is like a nugget of truth from Dr. Woods, and it kind of explains why why pulverization of the towers was an important design goal. The bathtub was something that was built around the original two tower complex, and it kept the Hudson River out and other water. And if you remember that one tower that was tumbling, if it would have fallen that great distance as a cohesive whole, it would have significantly damaged the bathtub, could have cracked it. And then you would have seen water from those other sources leaking in. And because they now had subway tunnels everywhere, there would have been a lot of flood damage to other places. So it was really important that they not damage the bathtub.
Well, there is evidence of bathtub damage under building 4.
No, that is wrong. Building 4 was outside the bathtub, and a lot of people try to use the geological formation underneath World Trade Center 4 to say, hey, they detonated a deep underground nuclear and it went and got the two towers, but the bathtub was intact, so there wasn't anything that you could ignite from underneath World Trade Center 4 that could affect either one of the towers. And the bathtub in between, when they excavated it, showed that it was still in place there.
There was a pre-construction survey of building 4, that did not match the post 9/11
Is this something
subterranean
that
mapping.
Lawrence submitted? Did he put it like in the chat or
Yeah.
something? Oh,
Well,
then maybe I should go look.
no, I'm just familiar with it. And maybe
Right,
he wants to address that.
there were a lot of surveys, geological surveys done on that whole area. And in the 90s, when they were able to use, surveys that would ping underneath the ground and measure the reflection, they knew that there was a geological formation underneath it. They knew it before they built World Trade Center 4. They just didn't know how deep it went. And then, so once the destruction was there, then they started excavating it. But it was known beforehand. The geological research that they did in the 90s, and when I looked at the reports that Lawrence submitted before, it's like, hey, they knew it was there. They just didn't know how deep it went, and this just gave them an opportunity to go chasing after to see how deep it really went.
Also, some of the videos you showed were quite compelling, but one thing I didn't see was sagging, which we do see videos of sagging, with the walls sagging inward.
Right, and
which
I don't see how fourth generation devices.
To me, the sagging inward indicates that the core was compromised. Not that I know much, but it just seems logical that the sagging in would indicate that the core was compromised.
But yeah, but we see in the building or the pictures of the spire, what they call the spire,
Right.
that the core wasn't failing. And that, in fact, that whole premise of, the floors somehow sagging and pulling in the outer walls, there's not a lot of evidence of that. But if there was, how it came about was that the fourth generation nuclear device zapped what was on the floor, what was on that floor, and there was nothing connecting the wall to the inner core anymore. And also, when the highly energetic neutrons from, like below, from a lower device, finally grazed the wall after going through, a bunch of floors, it left heat behind that caused them to sag. So they're trying to explain that sagging with the premise that the floors were still intact. But the fourth generation nuclear device says that, hey, the floors were already gone, and it was just the outer wall assemblies were just kind of barely held in place to contain that, until a device lower ignited and finally took it out and ejected it to the side.
Craig has his hand up.
Craig, you're on mute. Oh, no, you're not.
Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you. Hi, Maxwell. Sorry I didn't say hello at the beginning there. I was trying to get myself unmuted. I think you said hello to me and I didn't respond. Anyway, so my first two quick things I'll throw at you and let you just comment. One of them is I did an interview a few years back with Niels Harrit, where he talked about the fact that nanothermite, he considered nanothermite to be actually a fairly minor part of the whole destruction of the towers. So he said that there were obviously other things used besides that, and that they had done the majority of the damage. So I'd like you to comment on that, because when you say you've debunked nanothermite, what I'm wondering is, could you not be in agreement with Niels Harrit that perhaps nanothermite was used, but then just simply disagree on what did the bulk of the damage? And then the little sub question would be, do you consider all the illnesses, the cancers, that sort of thing that resulted from the World Trade Center destruction, do you consider those to be the result of radiation rather than breathing in toxic dust from the towers?
Okay, the first part of that, where Neil said that nanothermite was the small part. What I debunked was nanothermite as the primary mechanism of destruction. As far as I'm concerned, they threw everything, including the kitchen sink, at the towers. And if you try to say that something was not involved at all, like if I try to say nanothermite wasn't involved at all it takes is, Dr. Jones to throw his dust samples at me saying, oh, hey, it's here in the dust. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it was not the primary mechanism of destruction. So I'm all for all sorts of devices being associated with it, and if they can find nanothermite, great. But nanothermite by itself was a huge logistics hurdle to install, and plus, nanothermite doesn't. They don't try to address World Trade Center 5, 4, 6. I mean, they don't really go into any of those that have these, boreholes in it. Then now to your second part about the illnesses. Again, a lot of the radiation stuff, from first through third generation nuclear devices was that the fissile material was not used completely, and what remained, the majority of it remained because of the blast wave got spread everywhere. In this particular case, they were able to contain the blast wave so that it's like within the towers. Yes, there was probably fissile material that went around, but radiation and all that concrete does. I mean, yeah, there was plenty of things that you could point at that would cause sicknesses in people. But the EPA, they jumped right at the gun saying, "Oh, it's safe to be here." They practically fraudulent. I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that just about all the information on 9/11 is, mis or disinformation, and the EPA was a leader in that because they didn't want to create fears in New York City about that. If people thought it was just the dust and just normal dust, they would wear a mask. But when it comes to radiation and stuff, that is one of their successes. That hey, this was effectively a low radiation event. And also, if you look where Silverstein built his new reflecting towers, where the towers used to be, his reflecting pools, water is a great mediator for radiation. So if there was any residual radiation in the tower's footprint, those water reflecting pools will certainly help mitigate that. Did I get your questions?
Yeah,
Greg?
yeah, thank you.
Okay, Ross has his hand up. Ross, what you got going on?
Maxwell, I wanted to, first of all, thank you. I think it's a very informative presentation, one that I haven't been familiar with. And I will mention I'm an engineer, structural engineer, that my profession, my practice was in New York City for 30 years. I was there on 9/11. I won't go into more detail on my experience there in New York City with it, but basically, in the interest of time, if I were to really address respectably your hypothesis, it would take me as long to do that as it did for you to present it. So I'm just going to quickly say I don't think that your hypothesis is correct, but I do think that it could potentially be a part of what did happen that day, and also it, I don't know, and also I would say that it's I will look at how it could fit into what my hypothesis as a building professional. I think the key is going to be building professionals when we come out with the real truth on how this all happened. It's going to be building professionals that really put it to bed, and that's because it did happen, as you mentioned. This process began,
You're breaking up.
Buildings, they had to figure out that. Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I'll just be brief. I think there's a lot of useful information in your presentation, but I do not think it's correct. I think,
well,
I don't
Ross,
think in the end.
Ross, let me point out that I have no problems with my premise being wrong, but I do have problems with it not being acknowledged and not being addressed. And that has been a huge problem in the 9/11 truth community. And it can very well be wrong, and I have no problems with it being wrong, but it's going to take some, analysis and evidence to prove it wrong. And right now, everything I've gathered is that, well, it could have happened and nobody is driving. You're welcome to go to my blog. In fact, I encourage you to go out to my blog and debunk the hell out of it, because I don't want to be the sole useful idiot on this subject. But I've been shopping it around, and most of the people, even the celebrities, they have pawned themselves really bad on this topic, and that kind of discredits them from the get-go. Alfred, did
Yeah.
you have something? You got your hand on.
Yeah,
I
I
just
think
wanted-
back to
Oh,
nanothermite.
Alfred, before you start, Ross had one final thing.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was just gonna say, boy, we're in the same boat, Maxwell. We're in the same boat. I'm a structural engineer. I'm a member of Architects and Engineers. And, you know, I know all the different people and things, and I've submitted my paper, which was short. It was only 5 pages, but, and I've been treated the same way as you. And so I agree completely with what you said about how your views have to be investigated and looked at. And I'm in the same boat. And I'm a structural engineer living in New York City, collected dust, has, you know, all these things that nobody else can match in terms of their experience on the actual on the ground events of 9/11. And you know, I'm not being looked at. And, you know, maybe my hypothesis would be 2,000 words or 5,000 words, or it could be 1,000,000 words. But, you know, we get shut out of these things, and I don't think it's right. I think your point is very important.
Right. So I encourage you to go out there and tell me what I got wrong or what wouldn't be right, because I evolve and my premises evolved. Anyway, is it okay if we go off?
I agree to spend the time, which I don't normally, I won't always do with people, but I will. You deserve that time, and it would be good for me as well. So I'm gonna participate in your blog.
I'm a special case. Crick McKee can vouch for me. Alfred, did you have something that you wanted to contribute?
yeah, just quickly on the getting back to
And
nanothermite.
then we'll get to you, Chris. Sorry.
Is it your premise that all the red-gray chips that were found in the dust? I mean, there was a fellow, I've forgotten his name. He was had gone to Worcester Polytech and did a test on a lot of the dust, and it was unexploded nanothermite, super nanothermite, he called it. And I'm just unclear as to what you're saying about the nanothermite, that it was plenty of evidence it was there. And do you
Actually-
acknowledge that?
Alfred, I don't dispute that it might have been found in the dust, but in reality, it was only Dr. Jones's samples that I'm aware of that had that in there. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe you can find other people that had it. That's point number one. But my main point was that nanothermite, however you configure it with RDX or other things, could not have been the primary mechanism of destruction. And they even admit that. I mean, that's what Niels Harris said. Well, it played a minor part. So I have no problem with it playing a minor role. And maybe even some of the structural beams that we saw in other pictures, I think Dr. Woods or others collected it, where it's at an angle, shows these, you know, lower level support beams that were cut at an angle. And, oh, gee, nanothermite would do that. Yeah, I could agree, but nanothermite cannot pulverize the concrete. It cannot turn, you know, all the sphericals, the tiny iron sphericals takes a huge heat source, and it doesn't matter. And also, you know, when I shopped this around, when I confronted the people who champion nanothermite and said, hey, look at this video from NIST. How does NIST explain this evidence? Or how does nanothermite explain this video evidence of these, you know, wavy support columns and, you know, this gouge in there? They have no explanation. That's when they cut and run.
But didn't they refer to what they found was what they call a military grade super nanothermite that was a generation above a traditional?
That might be Alfred, but the deal here is that it's a logistic hurdle to get it installed on all the floors of both towers. Okay, so you might have some leeway saying that, you know, we have weeks before that where they prepared. My premise is that they could do. It's just like installing a, you know, wall-mounted TV. They could put all the brackets on the wall, and when they actually came in with the device looked probably like a fire extinguisher. They could do all the prep work in advance, and nobody would even know. And because we're just talking like at the most maybe 50 devices per tower, they could come in on a weekend when the Bob sniffing dogs were on vacation and install that. But nanothermite is a different beast. And you also have World Trade Center 7. You've got World Trade Center 4, 5, and 6. Those all have anomalies that nanothermite can't explain. And those who are promoting nanothermite don't offer any explanation whether they don't look into that something else. Now, I am also a member of Architects and Engineers for Truth. I was one of the first 1,000 signers. I'm not an architect. I am an engineer, but that's just, what I studied. It's not what my trade is now. But be that as it may, nanothermite does not measure up. I mean, they have those guys who promote it. There's something else that they were supposed to be looking for, that we expected them to research because they were, the leaders, or on the vanguard of researching 9/11. They didn't do it. I mean, it's a huge drop of the ball, and they delayed the game. They delayed our whole premise. For 2 decades, they've been stalling and delaying. So whether nanothermite was involved, I'll be willing to cop a plea and say, hey, yeah, maybe it was involved, but it was not the primary mechanism of destruction, and that's what counts. Okay, Chris, you had your hand up. You need to get yourself off mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, let me do a screen share.
I'm not in control of that, but I guess you can do it.
Okay, did you guys see my screen share right now?
Yes,
Yep.
we can see it.
So there's this individual, and this his name is Pasquale Buzzelli, and he claims to be on stair 22 as the towers fell down. Okay, and he landed on about stair 4. So he surfed down 18 flights of stairs as the towers fell down, and he would have been right in your cone, right in your 4th generation nuclear cone, which is thermal and kinetic. I mean, you're promoting the hypothesis that your device acts thermally and kinetically. Is that true?
No, that is not true.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, anyways, but you do say it's thermal. You say it's thermal, right?
Yep. No, what I say is that it released highly energetic neutrons. When
Okay.
those
Well,
neutrons,
yep. Okay. Well, let me just But
let me stop you here,
okay.
because I know there are people. But let me address this, okay? Because there are other survivors in different stairwells.
That's
9/11
correct. That's correct.
9/11 was not a perfect operation. We already know that there were under rebel hotspots, which is an indication that maybe several devices didn't reach their full nuclear yield. If the device that was closest to those survivors, failed or got misaligned, aimed someplace else, they would have been unaffected, because this is a DEW weapon, a directed energy weapon, and if it got misaligned or if it failed, they would have been spared. They got lucky, very lucky. But this guy, surfing down, 18 floors or whatever, yeah, that's a device going from underneath him, but it didn't hit him because it wasn't aimed at him, so to speak. And to the concept of this is something that Dr. Judy Wood supporters promote. They say it wasn't kinetic and it wasn't thermal. Kinetic means, motion like a missile. Yes, it wasn't, broadcasting that, because the neutrons were passing through the materials. Now, to say that it wasn't thermic, meaning the heat wave from a normal ignition of these devices, was localized, but the energy when it passed through material, what it often left behind, the energy that left behind was in the form of heat. But
okay, well, let me can I finish my question? Okay,
please go.
Okay, so let me move on to my next question, which you might not even be aware of this piece of evidence I'm presenting here, but there was the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church just across the street from the south side of the South Tower of WTC2, when retrieval of the relics in the church were undertaken in the following days. Only a few pieces survived, and one find was called a miracle. The great miracle was the recovery of the icon of Saint Spiridon. The silver around the icon had melted, but the paper icon had not burnt. So you're saying that your 4th generation nuke, when aimed at a painting, will melt the silver and spare the paper?
No, actually, because this is off to the side, I think this is a more of an effect of the electromagnetic pulse. Okay.
Huh.
And also remember, there were other buildings like 4, 5, and 6 that were close to the ground that I did not attribute properly but as how an electromagnetic pulse would work on that is that it would affect the metal, and it would induce eddy currents in the metal. When the eddy currents heat up,
So it would heat the metal, you're saying?
right, and it
Okay.
could, but the EM pulse would not necessarily affect the paper, and depending upon where this was, that effect that you're showing, I think Dr. Wood or one of her supporters presented that to me in one of my discussions, so I have seen it before, but it wasn't
Okay.
the
Well,
neutrons.
hold on,
Yep.
because if you go to the this is very important. Maybe this is a piece of evidence. You know, you talk about Easter eggs, okay? When I go to the 9/11 museum, you know, just by the way, I'm a licensed engineer. I have a degree in aerospace engineering, and I've worked several years for structural steel fabrication industry. So I consider myself, you know, a pretty good researcher in understanding all this. Now, when I go to the 9/11 museum, they actually have a Bible that's coated with steel. It's fused to a piece of steel, and there's steel dripping over the pages of the Bible. So explain to me how hot steel doesn't burn paper.
So is that really steel, or is it
That is
concrete,
really
or what is
steel.
it?
That is really steel. I saw it for my own eyes. It was donated to the 9/11 museum by a firefighter at a later date. And there's a Bible fused. First of all, I mean, how do you turn steel into like Play-Doh to get the Bible imprint? But there is a scientist and an amateur inventor that has demonstrated a lot of these effects in his laboratory. His name is John Hutchinson. And
I'm familiar with
you
him.
can see him, he can take a steel rod and he can cold melt it. So if I think that I think that you've hit upon a lot of good points in your premise, but one thing you got really wrong is that heat did not melt everything. There's a lot of melted steel.
I
and
never
it
said
wasn't-
I never said it did. What I said was that the neutrons went into the material to the whole molecular structure, and in some cases left energy behind, and that energy often took the form of heat, and it was where it was aimed at. That's the nuclear emission. But there was also
but it could also be, well, it could also be molecular destruction, or it
no,
could
but
be
I'm
breaking
saying
the
that this
molecular
damage
bond.
here was probably was more like the EMP, that it created eddy currents and, you know, softened it, the metal up, but the EMP, because it's electromagnetic energy, doesn't really affect the paper.
Yeah.
But it is up to you to describe this. You know, this comes from Dr. Wood. I think that's how I also came across this, and her due explanation does not explain this, and she doesn't power her stuff very well. I mean, she goes off into cold fusion, and
But hold on. She does say the process is not thermal nor kinetic, and that's something that you
and
really
that's
have
not,
to look at.
and so we're in agreement. We're essentially in
Okay, so
agreement.
we are in agreement then. Well, I'm not sure that you'd want to classify it as a fourth generation nuke. Why don't you just classify it as a directed energy weapon?
Because it is. All fourth generation nukes are in the category of due. And that
Uh,
is where Dr. Judy Wood really screwed the pooch, because she did a shitty job of researching due, because there's a whole bunch of
I agree that her research is incomplete, that she doesn't say where the devices were. I personally like, I don't know if you saw Dick Allgaier, but he remote viewed it, and he did say like a fire extinguisher, if you were to have several of these devices on every fifth floor and synchronize them, you could get, you know, the molecular dissociation effect. And then if that wasn't done, you could also hit it from above with the advanced Star Wars technology, you know, like a Buck Rogers disintegration weapon, which, by the way, you know, Juan O'Sullivan, who's got millions of viewers all across the country, went on record and say we can park satellites 24,000 feet that beam down interfering microwaves and can have the effect on materials. So
they can, and they do, but that's a different energy spectrum. That's electromagnetic energy, which I'm saying that this damage here reflects from the EMP. But the neutrons and where they were aimed is a different story, a different form of energy, and it's a different concept.
But it was a very gentle it was a surgical dustification of the towers very gently. As I mean, I can show you a small video of what a half-ton TNT does to an 8-ton whale, and you know we don't see anything like that when the towers come down. just a little bit of regular, explosive
well,
energy from
I welcome
TNT.
you to put links onto my blog, and we can have discussion, or send me email. Actually, my blog, the comment size is pretty small. Email
But I just think that you're making a mistake when you say that the beams melted because of heat. I think that the beams jellified because of the process. So
no, I'm saying that neutrons went through it and did volume heating on the beams, and I didn't say that they melt. I said that they lost their rigidity, so to speak,
Right.
which is really a high temperature. But it's the energy was put in there. It's not like there was a bomb that then
but you also
then
see,
emitted
you
a
see,
blast, a heat
right.
wave that did it. That's
You-
not the argument
you
at all.
see, you see John Hutchinson when he's melting
He's
a rod.
disinformation. He is one of the kooky umbrellas that I think Dr. Wood was forced into including in her book, because they don't power his Hutchinson effect with anything, and they hand wave cold fusion, and they don't say where the devices were planted, and they let it get framed as beams from space. So there's all sorts of, and she doesn't draw any conclusions.
Well, yeah, but did you
you
think
can only
that-
take it so far.
Have you studied John Hutchinson's?
Yeah, it's
have you
inside
looked at his
Dr. Wood's.
documentary? So did you think
No,
he's
well-
deceptive, or you think he's putting out real? Do you think his effects on metal with interfering microwaves in a static field? Do you think that's correct, or is he?
I do think it's correct. I just don't think it's applicable to 9/11.
Well, I think it's very applicable. When I
Well,
see
maybe it
that
is.
he's
Maybe
melting-
there's. See, okay. Here's something to point out: is that 9/11 was a showcase event. They had all sorts of generals and majors that were literally dying, with itchy trigger fingers to use these nuclear weapons, and certainly, what is it? The Israelis, I think, the Mossad, who were boots on the ground, they were dying to do this. So that's why you see different effects in World Trade Center 6 and World Trade Center 4 and in the towers. They were kind of proving what they could do. And of course, they're going to frame it all as being not very, radiation intensive.
You see the effect on my screen share with a 2x2x7
Right.
metal rod?
That's wonderful evidence. That's what I call
Okay, so
dangling innuendo.
do you think that that's real? Do you think that John Hutchinson?
I do think that that's real, but what
Okay,
I don't
okay.
think it's applicable to 9/11
Well,
because
but-
neither Dr. Wood or Hutchinson explained how it would be powered or how it would get into the towers.
Well, that's right, because their research is incomplete. But anyways, this rod that I'm showing you, if you were to touch it, it's cold. So it's some type of fantastic technology that they're using that we're not aware of. And fortunately, John Hutchinson stumbled upon it, doing a lot of his experiments with Navy surplus equipment. And incidentally, I'm told that I think he only used 150 watts to melt that steel rod. So another, if this technology is real, I mean, imagine what it could do to a water molecule. We could all be driving cars around on just pure water. And I know of a few inventors have actually done that. So
I agree that the technology is real, but they have not demonstrated how it would be applicable to 9/11, how
Yeah.
they would power it, how they would position it. They let it get framed in different ways. They let this dangling innuendo distract us when really the fusion, the evidence is in the dust. We've got tritium. I mean, that is really all and the exuberance of the justification is a huge energy sink that they do not provide.
But you have evidence of your 4th generation nukes, though. I mean, you can send that to me.
What I'm saying, yeah, well, because
come
Dr.
forward.
Andre Gaspaner wrote about it and talked about it, and he was doing this for the full decade leading up to 9/11.
So yeah, I mean, I welcome you send me any research, any
The links are there. The links are there.
Well,
in my
talking about the
presentation.
4th generation nuke,
Yeah,
the
he talks-
capabilities, the destructive process that it uses when it explodes. I mean,
No, well,
it's all
I have to
very
say this:
fascinating.
Dr. Andre Gaspaner is speculative as well, because when he talks about 4th generation nuclear devices, he's talking about a pure fusion device. So it's really late 3rd generation, early 4th generation that was still of a hybrid nature, where you needed a fission stage and a fusion stage. But the evidence of fusion is there. The evidence of fission and fusion are both there. So to be arguing about other things and coming from outer space and whatnot is kind of defeats the purpose if the dust already shows what they might have used. I mean, nuclear energy is well understood. We had 50 years, 60 years of research before 9/11 happened, and of course, the last 2 decades of the century, they put a clamp on what was made publicly available. Anyway, David, you've got your hand up. Can we get what your question is?
Okay, yeah, thank you for addressing my questions.
Thanks so much. I was very impressed. The most important thing to me was I did not know that Judy Wood does not come to any conclusions. I assumed that she did. I am the only MIT grad you'll ever encounter who hates machines, and I'm never going to be able to understand most of what you said. And I'm not going to do the research because I don't do research, not because I don't have time to do this research. I love people and I'm an organizer, but I'm very pleased to know that Dr. Judy Wood did not come to conclusions and she just presents evidence that means so much to me. I once had dinner with her. I do hope you won't mind answering Susan's earlier question of what state do you live in?
Oh, I live in Colorado.
Thank you. That's all.
So yeah, I read her book. I'm impressed with it. I even have it on my desk here right next to me as I'm having this talk. But when I come in discussion with even some of the ardent Judy Wood supporters, what is it, Andrew Johnson and others who've sometimes made an appearance on my blog. Other times I run across them in Mr. McKee's group. They were very limited in what they could discuss, and what they bragged about. They bragged about, well, Dr. Wood doesn't come to any conclusion. In fact, some of the people I may have encountered may have been like an alias of Dr. Wood. That's kind of how I interpreted it. But at any rate, they brag about her not having any conclusions, and I agree. She has no conclusions, connects no dots. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to just look at the evidence, which is what she was telling us about, and take it to the next level.
Max, we're coming up to 9 o'clock.
I'm
not
sorry
sure
that I
how
went
much-
so long, but this was an important topic. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah, no, it's been fascinating, I have to say. We do have agenda items that are pertinent to the 9/11, Boston 9/11. And I don't know if people want to continue with asking questions, but we did want to get to the agenda outside of your talk. So
Exactly. So I'll let you guys go on with that. I will send Susan my the PDF of my presentation. I'll do that right now.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Very much for joining us and addressing this important issue, Maxwell. I'm going to stop recording now as we move into our next phase of the agenda items. Thank you.